Hello, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. I'm here to help you decide if that book is worth reading of a second breakfast, or deserves the fiery pits of Mount Doom. I know you can't see her, but she is staring at me. I promise. It's been a bit since I've did one of these more secondary TBR videos, so just a small reminder. Every month, alongside my major TBR books, the ones I talk about in my TBR videos, I have a collection of minor TBR books that I read alongside it, generally throughout several months since my main TBR takes priority in my mind. But I'll typically read them between books, or if I polish off my main TBR for the month, like this month, early, I'll focus on those until I reach a point where I need to start focusing on the next TBR. That being said, if I read a book during that time that I feel is worth talking about, I'll generally make a video on it and publish it. Now in these videos, I typically take a break from my more normal style and just flow into the book and talk about it as I see fit. I'm going to do that again, but I'm going to try something a little new this video. Keeping it a bit more focused and trying it without the face cam and a slightly leaner script. I'm hoping it'll come off a little better, but for now, let's focus on that. So, I figured for this month of Star Wars, I'd stick with a more sci-fi TBR throughout. Naturally speaking, this has led me to some more older sci-fi novels that I have. In this case, Foreigner by CJ Cherryh. Okay, so, fun fact here. That name, for some reason in my mind, when I'm not looking at it, it keeps translating that to Cheryl. Cherryh. Point is, I keep reading that as Cheryl rather than Cherry. I don't know how to say that, so I'm just, yeah. Now, Foreigner is a book published on February 1st of 1991, which makes it weird that I'm calling it old sci-fi to me, because while realistically I realize that this book is now 32 years old, at the same time, as someone born only 5 years after this book's publication, that makes me feel incredibly old myself. But reading this older sci-fi and fantasy was something I wanted to challenge myself to do as I got more into this channel. And I definitely have to say that I did choose an interesting one to start. You see, Foreigner is more of a political drama using a sci-fi setting more than anything. Our main character, Bryn Cameron, is who we follow through most of the book, and is effectively a human ambassador to an alien race known as the Ativi. You see, in the future, the human race was forced to leave Earth after ruining it with the reckless pollution of the environment. Basically what's happening now. However, during their flee into space, the ship transporting them the station transporting them breaks down and sort of leaves them stranded in this solar system that they hadn't planned on going to. Unable to leave and soon abandoned by the station's actual crew, the many people on this station make landfall, and soon discover that this planet is inhabited by a race of tall, powerful, dark-skinned humanoids by the name of Ativi, which are basically they look like dark elves on steroids, based not only on the cover, but how they're described in the book as well. This was 200 years ago, and now we follow the exploits of the human ambassador, or the Padhi. I'm going to call it Padhi because that sounds more appropriate. That's how it's said in the Ativan language. In a mostly superficial role created as part of a treaty. See, First Contact didn't quite go as some had hoped. However, after assassins begin to try to take his life, Bryn Cameron is ultimately forced into between a rock and a hard place as he attempts to maintain his diplomatic purpose while also staying alive, in a society where there's 14 words for betrayal, but not a single word for trust. Now, Foreigner, by all accounts, is one of those books that, in theory, I shouldn't like that much. I admit that it has a very plotting nature. Bryn Cameron repeats many things to himself, almost to the point of ad nauseum. And there were admittedly long stretches of moments where Bryn gets so lost in his own head and thoughts that it's hard not to drift off the page. The book, above all else, again, is a political drama, and that's not everyone's cup of tea. It normally isn't mine. Funny enough, I found that I actually enjoyed this book overall. Not, might I argue, that I didn't find that there were points where I drifted off. The first two sections, or books as Cherryh called them, are ultimately pointless to the overall narrative and are terribly boring to get through. That section took me by far the longest to read, and it was only about 50 or 60 pages long. And there were definitely points during Bryn Cameron's sections that I felt less engaging than if I watched paint dry. But overall, I would say that this book kept me invested in spite of all that. I was interested in Bryn's struggles and adventures, so to speak. His dealings with the Ativan culture, who are both completely alien, but just similar enough to humans to have that connection. For example, one thing is, I think a lot of things that I did bring up that I felt personally worked in the long narrative is because they were often used to show Bryn's mental state at the time. As Bryn goes on, as he's caught up in this game of cloak and daggers that is common practice in Ativan courts, while basically having to viciously dig for even a single nugget of information from his own bodyguards, he understandably becomes more frustrated as the time goes on. Bryn basically feels like an active protagonist who was forced into a passive protagonist role. And I think that bleeds over well with the repetitious scenes. See, and it also factors into the fact that he's an ambassador to an alien race. As much as Bryn likes to think of Ativans sort of like humans, they're not. Their culture and their minds haven't come to understand the world in the same way that humans have. Therefore, he has to constantly go through conversations in his mind, make sure he's saying the right thing, make sure what he took as offense actually meant what he thought it meant. So, in a sense, when he does get lost in his own thoughts, it's understandable, again, but I won't say it's not boring at times. He's basically effectively living in a society trying to rule itself purely by logic, while much of his human beliefs and practices are ultimately rooted in emotion. For example, he knows that an Ativan he sees as a close friend one day might turn and stab him in the back the next if his Manchi, which I think most closely translates into duty despite not being exactly that, according to the book, but if his Manchi called for them to do so. And few would feel any regret because that's simply how the Ativan society works. So even when dealing with people he's considered friends, he has to constantly be aware if he's leading them into some type of trap or if they're leading him into a trap. More accurately, he's trying to suss out what kind of game they're playing and using him as a pawn in. I personally found it fascinating because I felt like a deep dive into a culture that genuinely felt like it existed within the world. And the Ativa, although fictional, felt real with their many beliefs and natures. There's even a bit of hint of chemistry between Bryn and his... okay, so I'm pretty sure only one guard is intentional, but I won't say that I'm not getting a bit of chemistry between both of his guards because, this book was published in 1991, but Bryn's chemistry with his male bodyguard is also kind of there, if I'm not lying. We'll see how that evolves later on, but I'm willing to bet that Bryn ends up with his female bodyguard by the end of this. However, that's not to deflate the point. The book is slow, and there will be several points where it seems like nothing's happening. And to be fair, that's not entirely wrong. I would argue that this book could have easily been about 100 pages shorter, and I don't think we would have had to sacrifice too much in the grand scheme of things. As effective as the redundant passages were at showing Bryn's increasingly frustrated mental state, it did bog the story down in places. And in certain scenes, the pages-long internal thoughts didn't really help, because it was already pretty clear what was going on to the audience, just not Bryn. Another example is the chase scene near the end. It stretched for far too long and did lose me at a few points, because my eyes started following the words, but I wasn't actually absorbing the information. I think the book is actually at its best when Bryn isn't alone with his own thoughts. But Bryn being alone with his own thoughts is a good portion of the book, unfortunately. In the end, although I would personally rate it a 7 out of 10 on personal enjoyment alone, I would say that from a more objective viewpoint and taking into account that this book is slow and plodding at several points, I would have to rate it a 6 out of 10. This is one of those books that I think would be a hard sell if you really tried to get someone to read it by just describing the plot. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who wants to try and nose their way into sci-fi, for example. It's definitely not a starter sci-fi book. You definitely have to have the patience, and you do have to appreciate political drama to some degree. And just be aware that certain sections will leave you kind of bored. At least they did for me. I really don't ever recommend I don't like recommending skipping portions of the book, personally. But if you do want to go into this, but you want to avoid some of the most boring parts, I would honestly say that the first 64 pages, books 1 and 2, you can probably just skip those and go straight into book 3. The story repeats enough information about what happened during these beginning sections that you won't really get lost as it becomes more relevant. And skipping these will technically mute the of a twist much later in the book. There we go, the of a twist much later in the book. But I don't think it would be by enough to really ruin said twist. But with that being said, that's all I gotta say on the book. This has been Afrodo Reviews. And just remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. Even the bad ones.